Thank you so much, everyone. When I got the call to be the keynote speaker, it didn't take me long to say yes, even though I haven't done hardly any speaking in the last 5 years. Somehow I knew there was something I needed to share with you. And as the months went by, you know how farming keeps changing and the world of food keeps changing. And you know, I'm almost as surprised as you're going to be, perhaps, on my presentation today. Because one of the things that is really most hard for me to do, as it might be hard for you to do, is tell your story. Even though we're chided at every intersection to tell our story, be evidence-based, but tell your story. And so I'm going to tell a story, and so I don't know if you even need your pencils and pens. I'd rather have you listening and thinking about your story, and your story especially as it might be woven with the land and something more permanent than perhaps all of we are. So I'd like you to come with me to my homeland, that state of Minnesota. And I'd like you to also know that my words today are my own. They don't represent my employer. Or even Laverne might not, he might even be surprised. But I have some things to share with you, and at the end of my presentation, you might be able to decide with me whether we can coexist in agriculture. It's a question for each of us and for all of us, and a very serious question for our time. What you see here is the state of Minnesota. And I think I'm going to start my timer. Can I do that, guys? Space bar, nothing happened, but press it again. These are sinister guys back here. They're all left-handers like me, so I trust them. Okay, I'm just going to tell you a story, and I'm not going to be timed because I can't get it to turn on. Here comes my sinister friend. We had a great talk about we're the only ones in our right minds and such, and our difficulties playing softball, having to take off our glove before we could throw the ball because we never got our own left-handed gloves, and slows you down just a little bit. There it goes. Thank you. So here's our state, my state. You're not all from Minnesota. We are from the western part of Minnesota. If you look at the yellow area, that's the prairie lands, tall grass prairie lands, and then you have the brown area sort of running diagonally. That's the hardwood region of the state, and then you have the coniferous region up north, 3 biomes. We are just at the lower border of the brown, and it just disappeared, and I didn't do anything. There we go. And yellow. So beautiful glacial moraine area in western Minnesota. 10,000 years ago, here's what was going on in our region. The bison were there, and they evolved this ecosystem. But of course, we know that the bison, although they might have been there for 10,000 years and numbered 60 to somewhere between 60 million and 100 million, they were exterminated. And so you can see the decline of the bison over time. And, you know, really made short work of. This is a pile of bison skulls. And so not all of the bison was made good use of. It was just annihilated for not good reason. And along with the buffalo, the first people of Minnesota, Minnesota is a Dakota name. This is a Dakota leader. His name is Little Bird. The place where I work today, the University of Minnesota Morris, was the place where his children were assimilated into white culture. His people were exiled from Minnesota after the Dakota War, which had everything to do with food shortages. Many wars are fought over food shortages, but the Dakota people had a bounty on their scalp when they were forced to leave their homeland. And it opened the way for white settlement, and it brought in my ancestors. You see, this is the earliest map of our area, and I'm going to take you on a farm tour. So I want you to get a little familiar with the area. This map is from 1868. And on this map, if you can read it, the large kind of amorphous area up there is a woods. And you'll notice it doesn't say woods, it says timber. All right, so that gives you an idea of what's about to happen. The railroads were deeded this land, and the first settlers that came in, they called it the stump woods because it was clear cut for railroad ties. And if you see just sort of the checkerboard, that's the position of our farm. You'll notice that the earliest survey maps here, the lakes were really well surveyed out because people needed water, right? They needed to drink surface water. They needed wood for fuel, the only fuel of the day, and they needed water to drink. So anywhere around water was a really great place for white settlers to come in, as my ancestors did. All of my ancestors are farmers. All of Laverne's ancestors are farmers. We are here because of that farm policy. And so at that point, one thing I learned when researching for this talk that I didn't realize is that there wouldn't have been a Homestead Act were it not for the Civil War. Because with the Civil War in the South, the slave owners seceding, who had fought the idea of homesteading because free people owning land, that can't be a good deal. And so when the Southern slave owners left Congress and seceded, President Abraham Lincoln was able to pass the Homestead Act, which brought in a lot of settlers to this area. You see there in Section 22, that's Swan Lake. Our farm runs just north of there, and then to the east of us is Lake Benson. And I'll be referring to those two bodies of water as we go through. So this is a picture from 1910. It's our farmhouse, and it was probably the heydays of agriculture. There were a lot of young people, and Melinda was saying, I get really excited about yearbooks of agriculture, and believe me, I do. Because I think what we're experiencing right now, if we think it's new, we're wrong. It has been set down in policy for a very long time, and the yearbooks of agriculture lay this out. At this time, before the gasoline engine, there was a surplus of young people, and so young people were considered, in excess in rural areas. They needed to go to the factories in the cities. And the language in these yearbooks of agriculture tells a story, too, about the country bumpkins and the people who had the inferior rural schools that they couldn't really even tell what a good school was. In fact, they just needed to turn it over to the city schools and consolidate and get rid of these schools. Both Laverne and I went to a one-room school, and so learned as a community of different ages. And so, we may be damaged for that, but we feel that we were advantaged for that. Not so when you look at the yearbooks of agriculture. So my ancestors came up through this era, and in what's new in agriculture, this is from a yearbook of agriculture, the earliest reapers there, and there's been tough times in agriculture, all the way through our history, and this was a time that was particularly tough. It preceded the Dust Bowl. There were many foreclosures during this time. Fast forward, this is my dad and I. My dad was a bit of an early adopter. I was born in 1955, and he sold his animals off the farm a lot earlier than my husband's family, and started to use chemical fertilizers a lot earlier, and was very proud of his straight rows and clean fields. As I journeyed on, Melinda touched on maybe I was a little embarrassed sometimes to have my dad's old pickup drive up to the school, so I'd have him drop me off a couple blocks away, things like that. My parents thought, she is never, ever going to farm. And maybe I didn't think I was either, because I went into the field of nutrition, and this is our dietetic intern class of 1979. I needed to get out of Minnesota. I was 22 years old and got an internship in New Orleans, and that's like traveling internationally perhaps and staying in the United States. It was a really great year, but we could not wait to get into those white lab coats. Be the expert, impart that scientific training onto the ready and willing believers. And my education succeeded in really eliminating any connection I might have caught growing up on the farm between that and food on the table. Science was so cool to me. And back then, I was really feeling quite insecure to know the answers and portray myself as the nutrition expert. I was reading a lot of peer-reviewed journals that were supposed to stack up into something solid, but to me they always ended with this troubling phrase, "Further research is needed." And you know, back then I didn't worry so much about who was paying for the research or how to make a whole out of those tiny conflicting parts, or a lot of things. I trusted our profession. I trusted a lot of people to go through those things with me. And I married someone that had a family just very much like me, closest to me on this side, in his plaid. Are you wearing plaid there, Laverne? Laverne's family. And so his family specialized in dairy. They kept the animals, very, very proud dairy family. And we proceeded to buy the dairy farm and to raise a family. And I was working in healthcare. And I kind of, I did the books on the farm, but I kind of maintained this parallel coexistence to what was going on until the crisis of the 1980s happened. At which time, my colleagues from urban areas said, "Hey, we're dietitians. Shouldn't we care about this?" And it was like the two hemispheres in my brain reconnected again. And I said, "Yeah, we should." It was one of those moments where literally I remember standing there on my dial phone talking to my Chicago-based friend and said, "Yeah, we should care about this." And so Minnesota Dietetic Association, I was active in that association. We started the Committee on Agriculture in 1986. It was disbanded 2 years later because the dietitians in the next election couldn't figure out what we would have to do with agriculture. So that was a very short-lived sort of thing. We were proud of our dairy farm, Hilltop Holsteins. Here's how it looked from the air. 82 cows, stanchion barn. We were in the young cooperators, the eagles flying into the future. We made those banners on the wall. We were young cooperators. I don't believe that any of those couples are still in dairying now, not a one. The discussions at that time were around bovine growth hormone, and we were opposed to it, but our dairy co-op was for it. We were asking questions like, who wants this? Who needs this? Who's going to profit from this? And it was a relentless sort of thing that was just marshaled through. And so we began to get a taste for what other influences there are besides ourselves in farming. And our family grew, and we had 3 children. This is 1992. Our son Jaden, our son Jerron, and her daughter Mariah. And the milking continued 39,554 times. Yeah, we kept tally, right? Yes, and our employee of 12 years, the guy in the blue shirt, good old Norwegian bachelor, funny and incredibly just a great guy and a wonderfully hard worker, married for the first time at age 57, and it took his wife 2 months to figure out that the wife of a dairy farmer is not what she wanted to do. So Kenny left our operation in 1998, and I was the new employee. April Fool's Day of 1998. But I was ready because, you know, all that behavior modification you do with dietetics, you know, people get to decide what they want to eat, and they have all these weird preferences and tastes and everything. You know, with cattle, I sort of had this idea, whatever you put in front of them, they'll eat. And I've always been fascinated with that stomach, nutrition. And so I was really looking forward to making this into something that it was not so low input anymore. And something that really turned us toward a higher input system was the fact that we were so low input we didn't vaccinate. And we got an airborne disease, and it nearly wiped out the herd. And so at that moment, we were seeking the help of some really highly qualified veterinarians. And they said, look, you've got these great genetics. My husband had been AIing in the dairy herd, nice genetics. You won't believe how many of these cows can milk 100 pounds a day. You won't be pushing these cows. You won't be pulling these cows. You will only be allowing them to perform to their genetic potential. Now, as a woman, I should have run the other way, right? Because this doesn't make good sense. But it was what the nutritionists and what the veterinarians were saying. They were with us. We were the scientific poster children of how to produce milk in an efficient way. And so we took our herd average to 25,000 from 17,000. And we did everything that they told us to do. And we had a lot of big vet bills in the process. I became the drug sensitivity tester. I was going to use all that microbiology that I had taken so long ago. And, I was really met with a lot of disdain, of people saying, so you aren't going to use your education? Yeah. At least there's only 4 things you need to know on the dairy farm. Yeah. I have never put into practice and all that I had ever learned. What didn't make sense to me, though, was the price of milk, and oftentimes we were milking below the cost of production. It was down there somehow below the support price, and it was hard work. We would go for 9 months without one milking off. Because you know how things crash when you're on a dairy farm and you get somebody, you're so desperate to have a day off, and then you pay for months after because things were kind of messed up. So we came to a turning point to look at our farm from a different angle. And Laverne had grown up with cows. He could tell me 100 different things that was going on with an animal just by walking up to her. Look at her eyes. Yeah, I'm looking. See how they're sunk in? Really? Look at the hair on her back. Sort of peaked up. Oh, yeah. On and on and on. Just that, those of you who have livestock, you've got that affinity, you have that experience, that's very, very valuable. But we didn't think that it was really valuable in the advice that we're given, get 100 cows more, 300, 600, 900, go into debt. And meanwhile, we'd been walking our land. We've been, we didn't know we were born into the tall grass prairie region. Where I grew up 20 miles to the south of here, there was not a trace of any prairie grass. And I had this perception of the prairie, it was exceedingly flat and boring, like one kind of grass. Who would want that? Of course we had to plow it up, right? Well, 20 miles to the north, there's these beautiful hilltops this is prairie smoke, and that's our dairy farm in the distance as we began to rethink what we were going to do. And, meanwhile, the dietetics profession, the yearbooks of agriculture, they ended in 1992. So they had been written since 1862 and 1992. And remember, when I was at the Minnesota Department or the Minnesota Dietetic Association, the Committee on Agriculture was ended in 1988 because what does dietetics have to do with agriculture anyway? So in 1992, my professional organization comes out with a position statement on agriculture and food biotechnology. And this position was reaffirmed in 1995 and 1998. It is the position of the American Dietetic Association that agriculture and food biotechnology techniques can enhance the quality, safety, nutritional value, and variety of food available for human consumption and increase the efficiency of food production, processing, and food distribution, and environmental and waste management. The American Dietetic Association encourages the government, food manufacturers, food commodity groups, and qualified food and nutrition professionals to work together to inform consumers about this new technology and encourage the availability of these products in the marketplace. Okay, where's the science in 1992 to back up this statement? Where's the science in 2016? So you would think this statement is over and done, right? Not so. So our profession that didn't really know a lot, didn't see the connection in 1988, all of a sudden had a position paper claiming, you know, we should be the cheerleaders of this. Wow, we seemed to have a lot of help with writing that position paper. And as you dig into it, indeed, we did. So this was also right about the time when we attended our first Moses meeting. And I couldn't believe the difference. I was used to going to meetings with all men, pretty much, you know, older, white guys. Kind of the herbicide of the year, here's how you use it, here's what you grow, let's eat some instant mashed potatoes and overcooked corn and food of unknown origin, go home and sleep it off. Dietetic conventions weren't much better. The food was prepackaged and it had a label and it was always waiting for you on your chair. But my goodness, we came here. You guys really eat good. I never had food like that at a conference that I was going to. People were upbeat. That was really different. People were not all gray-haired. People were talking to each other and asking questions. There were even breastfeeding mothers. Wow, I thought I had died and gone to heaven. And all of a sudden, we thought, wow, there's people doing this. And we were asking questions of organic farmers like, yeah, but what do you do when your animals get sick? And they go, well, they don't get sick. Yeah, but what do you do when they do? They don't get sick. Okay, so we had to live that, and now where the people go, they don't get sick. We have 150 cows, just like we did on the dairy. We spent $12,000 a year back in those days trying to keep our herd healthy or fix the train wrecks that often occurred. Now we spend more on our 2 German shepherds per year. High maintenance dogs that they are. Not really, you know, they're actually pretty healthy, but the cows are healthier. So it gave us the courage to sell those cows, and that was not without trepidation or a lot of concern. Laverne's dad was still milking with us. He was 83. He said he had a lot of good years left. You know, he had purchased harvest stores in the 1980s, 20% interest. He was thinking about the future. And what do? We sell the dairy herd. It was their whole identity, and it was really, really hard. I sort of think they blamed the daughter-in-law, but, you know, you live in farm families and you understand those dynamics that there's generational stuff, you know, there's in-law stuff, there's sibling stuff. It's too bad because I think a lot of it's to do with undue outside pressure. So the dairy herd was sold, and we got this little California tourist book of what cows look like when you see them and you're driving through California, and one has horns and it's gray and one has spots and it's this. And we just started over because we knew Holsteins would never make it in a grazing system, and we started to really identify what these plants were on the prairie and think about, whoa, you know, this system used to work. Large herbivores on the prairie. We got in touch with a grazing specialist, and he helped us lay out a grazing plan. We went back and forth on where to lay the water lines, how to start working into organic, how to put up some fence, how to get portable water out and about around the farm. You can see Laverne does the work and I take pictures. And we started to see our beautiful land respond, because part of why we wanted to change is that we love our land so much. And what you see there is Swan Lake, that lake to the south. We have 9 bodies of water either touching or on our farm. And it's really wonderful what cattle seem to be able to do. If I can run this video. Okay, guys went through this a lot with me. There they are, there we are. Yeah. Rotational gradient at Prairie Horizons Farm. That's not how our calves used to look in a dairy. Holsteins, they didn't get to learn from their mothers and grandmothers. Oh yeah, but you're in Minnesota, how can you do that? How can you graze in Minnesota? Turns out cattle will walk right by full hay bunks and paw around in the snow. They love this fresh frozen green grass. It's good for them. They even like stuff that we consider, you know, if we like burdock, who's familiar with burdock, quite a few people are familiar with burdock. You can buy it in human nutrition stores at great cost. The powdered roots of it is supposed to be very nutritious. But if you look it up for animal nutrition, all they say about it is that you should spray it with 2,4-D. But we have a different method. You know, this is burdock. You're all familiar with that. And when we stopped using chemicals, it seems like the weeds really responded. You know, and I grew up with a dad that thought clean fields were, you know, monoculture, and that was it. Beats 2,4-D all to pieces. And then the fun part, we started to repopulate our farm with young people. We had to borrow them though, and they were ready to come. And this young woman had a dream of being a veterinarian, but she had no large animal vet experience, and she was our first intern on our working lands project. We borrowed 260 goats because we thought our neighbor's pasture could really use it going through to, we'd heard that goats would really get rid of the buckthorn. Buckthorn's one of their favorite things to eat. They also happen to like Canadian thistle. They like to eat it at night, so I had to sneak out there at night to see them eating it. And you know, they did, between them and the cows, you might see a fence line somewhere in there, and on your right is the neighbor's pasture, and on the left is the wetlands management area, and I don't know why they call it management, because they bought it 30 years ago and never did anything with it. But we started grazing in cooperation with, you know, this goat producer and government agencies, and, you know, it didn't take long. A few years later, and the cattle and the goats have done a tremendous job of really beating back some of the things that have taken over the tallgrass prairie. And we began to really appreciate, this is the pasque flower. These are all original native seed bed flowers, forbs. The prairie smoke, we didn't plant these. They're the original 10,000-year-old seed bed. Yellow lady slipper, lead plant, prairie lily, prairie onion, coneflower, echinacea. Truly quite the wonder to behold, and way into the fall, the bottle gentian. And it wasn't only the flowers, it was the dick thistles and the bobolinks and the eastern and the western meadowlarks. You see on that fence line, those are all dick thistles. Grassland birds are declining more than any other species. But what Eric Motter said about if you build it, they will come, really came true for us. And now we hope we can find a way to get them to stay. There were ones we didn't identify, and old familiar friends. And we began to try to duplicate that tallgrass prairie, which was our gold standard that the rocks and the hills had protected from the plow. And here's a field that we restored into a very diverse mix of perennials that the cattle really do love, and so do pollinators. Listen to the pollinators. So we were feeling like we had made a really good choice, and farming was truly fun again. The spirit of the farming came back. We started planting an orchard, and you see that gas-powered auger there. That's our son, Duran. He's planting in the orchard, and the rest of us there. But unfortunately, we experienced extreme tragedy. Our son died at the age of 22 of a rare form of childhood cancer. And so his legacy is an orchard. And the community came around us, our friends came around us. They planted an orchard, and it helped to heal us. The land helps to heal us. We have sorrow in common with all people throughout the ages, and the land helps to heal us. These are apricot trees. We had our first really big crop last year, and plums. We worked with a private fruit breeder, Dave Griffin, who was incredible. You know, we didn't know much about edible trees or bushes or all of these things. He opened us to this whole world of private fruit breeding, 20 different kinds of grapes. We said, you know, we'll never make good wine. We know people who make good wine. Just give us table grapes or, you know, sure, he could do that, 20 different kinds. We had planted some aronias already. And Dave was a master grafter. This is Dave. Huge giant of a man, big hands. His dad was the hometown surgeon, but when he was around a tree and a scalpel, those surgical hands that he got from his dad kind of came back into practice. And how little we knew about trees. This was a wonderful, and it is a wonderful crabapple tree on our farm, very prolific and just very sweet and disease-free. And I was lamenting to Dave, you know, when that goes down, what a loss it's going to be. And he looked at me like, would you like me to make you another? I'm going, you're God? So Dave shows up with 6 more of these, so we no longer have to worry. But unfortunately, Dave didn't stay with us long enough. The last thing we planted with Dave there were peaches. Dave had a dream to be the Minnesota peach and to grow Minnesota hardy peaches. And we planted 121 with him the summer before he suddenly died in his chair one January, very cold January. His peaches that he was nurturing in a high tunnel because no one else knew how to run that high tunnel didn't make it. We still have 115 of Dave's peaches growing. What a legacy one person can leave. They've been through 3 winters now. Dave always said, hey, you're only one good winter away from a good peach. They grow on 2-year-old wood. So thank you, Dave. We also ran into researchers who were intrigued by what we were doing. Here you see a 2-acre research plot where a biologist from the campus where I work comes out and, you know, measures tirelessly what is going on here with the different kinds of nitrogen that we might be using, the white and purple prairie clover, the manure. This is the only part of our farm now that isn't organic because we use like a half-rate commercial fertilizer and full rate. And what she's trying to discover is that if our field trials hold hold water under scientific scrutiny, and it appears that they do, that the worst way to manage prairie grass is with commercial fertilizer. These plants don't need a lot of nitrogen, and when you fertilize them, what you're doing is really fertilizing the first few inches. Their roots go down deep. You're wasting your money, and you're growing a big crop of thistles. So very interesting to kind of get scientists' perspective. We're happy for the soil scientists that work with us, and especially for the young people who come out and look at the prairie, look at what we're doing, young dietitians who come out and want to see what happens to food from farm to table. I've become more encouraged about my own profession because of the professional group I belong to, the Hunger and Environmental Nutrition Group. Some of the representatives are here today, young dietitians looking for a way to really discover how they can be useful in growing a good and healthy food system. We've also linked up with Native American tribes who trade seeds, heritage seeds. These wonderful squash, Winona LaDuke named them Gete Okosoman, which means in Ojibwe, cool old squash. We were given 4 seeds. 3 other people couldn't grow their 4 seeds that they were given, so we had a total of 12 seeds. 16 seeds, and from them 9 plants grew. And from those 9 plants, grew 300 pounds of the most delicious squash I've ever eaten. It's fed many, many, many people since this time. And of course, we're working on this younger generation. This is our granddaughter, Ellery, watching Grandpa hatch those bales out of the back. And I'm happy to report that our granddaughter, Willa, is scoring very high on the early farmer aptitude tests. She doesn't care a bit about that toy in front of her. She wants to check out the onions. So in some ways, it seems like we've made it through a whole lot to become Prairie Horizons Farm. But yet we realize that farming is always a dynamic system, as is life. And what you see here is an intersection on our property. The gold in the background was our wheat crop, and on this side are our pastures. And you see the 2 fields of corn pinching in there? One of them the one on the right belongs to our neighbor, but it's farmed by someone who comes from 30 miles away, and the other one comes from 40 miles away. They're not exactly all that neighborly sometimes. And in fact, we had this little fence line encounter. This is a section line laid down in those 1868 maps. The flag is the section line. The fence, we needed to put in a fence to contain our cattle, and also the tillage equipment kept coming across this road that connects the 2 parts of our farm and tilling up our road. So we had to talk with our neighbor about that, but it wasn't really good enough just to talk. Soon there were two lawyers, and the renter and the neighbor, landlord on the fence line, telling us that we were really difficult to farm around, and they farmed in the acceptable way. And that when we saw these cobs that were sliced, neatly and blown over on our side of the fence, that they couldn't control what the squirrels do. And of course, it's their combine spilling over. And these are good people, and if you're conventional farmers, you're like we were. You're scared of doing something different, but to think that this is the only way, I think that's where we maybe have gone awry. And what you see here is this trail that divides our organic farm from the neighbor's farm. And you might see some brown there, and that is indeed, we have heavy winds. We lost our whole grove to 85-mile-an-hour winds, but we have more winds all the time. This is the soybean litter blowing off of the field, and you can get an idea of how forceful it was blowing off, because you can see that soybean leaves on that fence line. So unfortunately, the soybean stubble is also tilled in the wintertime, and that means a lot of blowing dirt. So the 9 bodies of water, here's how it looks on a summer day. Here's how it looks in the wintertime. This is not our soil. And I realize I'm probably, putting our organic certification on the line to tell you these things, but we're in trouble. We're in trouble, all of us are in trouble for treating our soil like this. This is how it looks in the spring on top of our pasture lands, the amount of soil that blows from the soybean field over into our field. And next I'd like to show you, I could show you the 2.5-hour feature film of last August 2nd. I'm just going to do the trailer version. But it's going to be a few minutes, and I'd really appreciate it if you'd look and you'd listen, because it's part of our discovery about whether indeed we can coexist. It goes on for a while longer, but I think you get the idea. So wanted to refresh your memory a little bit about how our farm looks there. You've got the farm place, you've got the paddocks, the little rectangles where we move the cattle. The area that was being sprayed in the last part, we were out in that prairie for a Sunday evening walk where the pollinators, we had the film earlier. So we went over to this fence line where our cattle were grazing, so that little strip there is where the spraying was done. And so we took a walk last week because, in the summertime, that's how it looks. But I thought you'd all want to see like how it looks now. And here we are at that intersection that we saw before with the corn that's kind of pinching in on an area where we go back and forth out of the 3 seasons of the year many times every day to tend the cattle and the garden and the orchard. And that's what we were being pinched off from, is access to the other part of our farm. So fairly deep cover of soil blowing either way through the intersection there. And you can see our land here on the left and then the soybean field on the right. And as we walk, you see the bare fields up on the left here, still walking just on our borders. So this is like the organic buffer. So we may lose our organic certification after this, the way this is going. So, not our soils though, but those are the soils. That was the soybean ground that was being sprayed. And when we were talking to our son and his friends, this is where we were. That's our organic sign there. So the snow is dirty coming in and clean going out. And then this is looking the other way. So if you're looking at that last picture, you turn around and this is our pastures. And so the snow is still there and clean. And here's that little strip that was being sprayed, and that's Swan Lake down there. So you see it's not at all a very wide strip that was receiving that spray. And yes, we're on drift watch. That doesn't mean anybody calls us or warns us or tells us what they're going to be spraying. We're strictly on our own, pleading with our neighbors, writing them letters saying, here's what we got at stake. Please don't spray us. Please don't spray our heritage orchard. But we don't seem to be getting through, and our laws don't seem to be protecting us. So as we walk along this fence line, this is where we were watching the spray planes. And Laverne is standing down in the neighbor's field, and you see the erosion that's gone on there over the years, the difference between having permanent perennial cover and what would be sloughing toward the lake. Here's another shot of me at that point where the fence line is that different because of the tillage and the sloughing towards the lake. And yes, there is some runoff from our farm going into Swan Lake, but we don't think that perhaps our runoff is the major problem there. Here you're looking toward across this little strip of beans, the north side of the lake that's between our property and Swan Lake, off into the native prairie hills. These are the original tallgrass prairie hills. A little closer up, you can see that the farming being done up into the hills. $8 corn was really bad for native prairie. You would think that maybe there was enough corn in the country, but many of our native prairie hilltops got destroyed during the $8 corn era. And this doesn't show up very well, but it's basically the difference between clean snow and dirty snow. The snow blowing off of our field is clean, and what we collect on ours is dirty snow. There's a little better shot of it. Here's a picture of a wetland that, complete tillage all around the wetland, and a wetland on our farm that's surrounded by pasture land. And then finally, going down to the end of the orchard, there you see our organic sign. This is the farmer that comes from 40 miles away. He's probably there 3 days in the spring, maybe 3 days in the fall. We've written him letters. We've asked him if he saw our organic sign. He said he didn't. So that's the tree in the orchard. That's the distance there that we have between the apple trials that Dave Griffin grafted for us, Geron's orchard. And this is how it looks from their side of the fence, but they haven't noticed that sign yet. And here's something that we have called to their attention too. The story goes through many generations that there are Indian graves on this hill. And this is now in the possession of the farmer from 40 miles away. And we've pleaded with him, but he really doesn't perhaps understand what we're doing. We had to buy a little strip along his field. It used to be owned by Laverne's brother up until a couple years ago. And had we known that the sale was imminent, we'd have probably tried to work with Laverne's brother, but it was kind of sprung there. And so this year we planted 6.5 acres of pollinators. And we happened to run into this farmer. He was up in going over his field on New Year's Eve day, and I had the chance to ask him, first of all, if he planned to use 2,4-D, because remember the letter we wrote, the orchard, we don't want 2,4-D. It's a bad actor and it will destroy us, so please don't destroy us. We literally have to beg. And I said, have you ever thought about planting pollinators? And his immediate answer was no. And then he said, what do you mean? And I said, well, it's nice you're staying a little ways away, but if you put pollinators in, then you wouldn't have weeds there, you would have pollinators, which can be useful. And he said, well, the reason we have weeds there is because of you. And so I could see that we weren't really getting anywhere, but we do still try. And so this is just a picture of succession planning a couple years ago. There's lots of things to think about in farming. It's very, very, very complex. And yes, I do try to read the yearbooks of agriculture, but I do it in such a way that it makes me feel like, it's been there, and we keep trying, and we aren't noticing that the same systems are still in place. And I should have known when my congressman, Colin Peterson, then chairman of the House Ag Committee back in 2007, leading up to the 2008 Farm Bill, in a room full of 30 people, Colin has been very instrumental in, ethanol industry incentives. And so I was trying to transpose that into local foods. Like, what if we did that for school children? What would that mean, have incentives in the school system? And he said to me, they hate people like you in Washington. Do you know who writes the Farm Bill? It's agribusiness. It's their lobbyists. They're crawling all over the Capitol. They're really well funded, and they're motivated, and they're smart, and they write the Farm Bill. And when they're done, they put on a few plums to placate you. Yes, we do need to change. We need to change national policy, but in order to do that, we also need to link arms with people who care about food and who care about health and who care about a clean environment. I looked in the Yearbook of Agriculture, 1901. If you want to read it, I've got it right here. Because they did stop making them in 1992. And I was curious because, I was wondering if the Native Americans, if the Indians ever showed up, in the Yearbook of Agriculture in 1901. They did, in 2 places. Wild rice is gathered in the swamps about the lakes of northern Minnesota and Wisconsin, not Washington. The Indians go out in canoes early in September and beat the seeds into the boats. It is later re-cleaned and sold by sample. That was reference number 1. In the section, what can be done to make our scenic regions of the United States most available? Ore, chief of the Utes, parted with the remainder of their reservation, moved to a new home beyond the limits of the state, but his mission seemed to end when he was compelled to leave the home and the graves of his fathers, and he soon sickened and died. Well, how about prairie? Certainly there must be a mention of the prairie in the 1901 book. No mention, but a chapter on how to eradicate prairie dogs. Our Great Plains, one of the chief enemies to agriculture is the prairie dog. The animal appears to be increasing rapidly, owing to the destruction of its natural enemies, chiefly coyotes, badgers, ferrets, hawks, owls, and eagles. And how about orchards? With the growth of commercial fruit interests in the United States, the home fruit garden has been lost sight of. Only a few years ago, the owners of home gardens not only led in the production of fruits, but were also authorities as to how and where to grow them. And how about women? 1 reference. Here we go, hens. The need of experts, a new profession for women. From the foregoing, it will be seen that there is still a need for dietary improvement. But in order to bring about this, experts are required. These should not be mere cooks or even chefs, but persons with thorough scientific and practical training. It is scarcely going too far to say that a new profession for women is opening in this direction. Finally, another quote, Ralph Nader, a vigorous 81-year-old that visited our campus not long ago. Without justice, there is no freedom and there is no liberty. Growing up corporate means you don't understand the allocation of power over your lives. And Jim Garish, you may know Jim Garish. He's a grazer. He happens to be turning 60 years old today. And when I told him I was giving this presentation, I said, Jim, can I quote you? Because you have said so much in a short statement. Jim is an agronomist. He's a Master of Science in crop ecology. And he was asked what he thought of GMOs. He said, well, from the practical side of farming, Roundup-ready crops have not begun to accomplish what was expected of them. Pesticide use has gone up, not down. Glyphosate-resistant weeds have taken over millions of acres of croplands. Chemical cocktails to overcome glyphosate resistance have only accelerated the pace at which weeds are becoming resistant to several other herbicides. I guess I'm ready to say that I don't believe our scientific and industrial communities really have any idea what the unintended consequences of creating more and more GMOs will be. Largely, I don't think they really care because most of them are too linear and reductionist in their thinking to realize how badly they are screwing up the world around them. Bottom line is, I have zero confidence in the scientific integrity of the public or private sector scientists when it comes to really understanding the consequences of their actions. I also have zero level of confidence in any government agency to oversee or honestly investigate the ripple effect of GMOs in not only our food supply, but in the broader environment. Beyond the biological ramifications of GMOs, a much more serious threat to our life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is the unholy alliance between government and industry. What I refer to as the GAMPI complex. For those of you not familiar with that particular acronym, it stands for Government, Agricultural, Medical, Pharmaceutical, Industrial Complex. That complex is the enemy of our health and well-being. The current debate about GMOs is only the tip of the iceberg for what is really happening in our society and our communities. The stranglehold of an overarching federal government that is largely owned by multinational corporations is sucking away our ability to be free and independent citizens in what was once the greatest nation on earth. It is time for a revolution against GAMPI. Does that mean guns and bombs and blood in the street? I certainly hope not. What it means is the refusal to buy their products and peaceful resistance to government overregulation. Buy everything you can from your neighbors. Be innovative in figuring out how to do things differently than what GAMPI dictates. Take charge of your own health and well-being. And so it comes to that question, can we coexist? The answer is clear for us. You'll have to decide for yourselves if your situation is different. I did want to tell you my story today, but I also wanted to leave you with a word of hope, and perhaps a whole lot of hope. As we look at what feels like a movement about to occur, and we know that national policy needs to be changed. That's quite clear. The only thing is, if we look back, we don't have a lot of success with that, with how it's been going. I think it's really essential to link arms with food movements in your state. There are many, many people who are rising up and saying, it is not right that adult onset diabetes that used to be unknown in kids is now being diagnosed. 45% of the new diagnoses are in kids. It is not right that our rate of obesity and overweight and chronic diseases have doubled in the last 30 years. And so these are the people who need your food, they need our food. In Minnesota right now, we're calling this the MinnesotaFoodCharter.com, MNFoodCharter.com. There's 99 strategies of what we can do to improve our food system. And it involves things like food access and food production, food skills, cooking, of all things. And this is where we meet our indigenous sisters and brothers. It's where we meet our Black and our Latino and our Hmong populations that are reflective of the agriculture of our future. And it's where we can have a voice. So find the places in your state and cross-link with our state so that we have what I woke up last night dreaming about. My first dream was that a group of grandmothers had taken over the USDA. But it turned out to be just a dream. And then I started thinking about 4-H, and 4-H has been a good club. I started thinking about H4, H to the fourth power. Horton hears a who from the heartland. We need to really cross-link. We need to reach out to people who eat. And we have a framework now in Minnesota to do that. And I wouldn't doubt you have it in your state. And if you don't, please do borrow from us. I have signed up to be on the strategic planning committee of that food charter. And I think it's a really good and hopeful thing for farmers to not have to go it alone. Because going it alone really hasn't benefited us much all through our past and our history. So my yearbook of agriculture, the year I was born, water. That was the first mention of 2,4-D. This is Mr. Jim Garish, who I just quoted. And remember to enjoy every day, because no matter what happens, there's still love, and there's still life, and there's always going to be hope. Thank you.